Becka disappearing may have destroyed one wedding, but it could be setting up something far worse for Daisy. Because now that Garth's future bride is suddenly out of the picture, fans are asking one huge question. Will Gilead simply replace Becka with Daisy? On the surface, it almost makes too much sense. Daisy is already inside the system, Garth is climbing the ranks, and Gilead loves arranged marriages that reinforce order. But here's the problem. If Daisy really ends up with Garth, it could quietly destroy Mayday's entire mission. And that opens the door to a much darker possibility, involving one of the most dangerous men in Gilead. So is Daisy about to become Garth's replacement bride? Or is the show setting up something far more terrifying? Let's break this down. Before we jump into the theory, let's quickly recap what has everyone talking. Becka being temporarily removed from the equation completely changes the marriage dynamics inside the Testaments. Garth's plan's future suddenly looks uncertain, and because Gilead rarely allows this order to sit unresolved for long, viewers immediately started wondering whether someone else could take Becca's place. That naturally brings Daisy into the conversation. As a Pearl girl already positioned within Gilead's system, she seems like a logical fit. But once you step back and look at the bigger story, things become a lot more complicated. Because in the Testaments, marriages are never just marriages. They are strategy, politics, control, and sometimes punishment. The first thing we need to talk about is Garth himself. Up until now, Garth seemed to be moving along the exact path Gilead had planned for him. He's not a commander yet, but everything points toward him eventually rising in rank. His engagement to Becka felt like another carefully arranged piece of Gilead's machine. The system rewards obedience, loyalty, and structure, and Garth looked like someone following the expected path. But Becka disappearing changes that instantly. And here's something the Testaments constantly reminds us. In Gilead, personal loss rarely matters more than political convenience. When relationships collapse, the regime doesn't pause for grief, it reorganizes. That's why the idea of Garth receiving a replacement bride isn't crazy speculation. Gilead values appearances. Stability matters. A disrupted marriage arrangement is not just personal drama, it's an inconvenience to a regime obsessed with control. So naturally, Daisy becomes the obvious name fans throw into the conversation. And honestly, at first glance, the theory makes sense. Daisy is already deeply connected to Gilead's structure through her Pearl Girl role. She understands the expectations placed on women, she has discipline, and she occupies a social position that aligns neatly with someone like Garth, a guardian on the verge of something bigger. Unlike marriages involving elite commanders and powerful families, a Daisy and Garth pairing wouldn't require extravagance or political theater. It would feel believable inside Gilead's system. In fact, if you only looked at surface-level logic, this almost feels like the cleanest answer. But here's where I think the theory starts to crack. Because Daisy is not just another girl inside Gilead, she's an asset, and that changes everything. One mistake a lot of fans make when analyzing the Testaments is forgetting that Daisy's storyline isn't designed around survival alone. It's designed around infiltration. Her value to Mayday depends entirely on proximity to power. The closer she gets to the people running Gilead, the more useful and dangerous she becomes. That's exactly why a marriage to Garth feels strategically limited. Not useless, limited. And there's a difference. Could Garth eventually become a commander? Absolutely. That possibility matters. But right now, he's still climbing. If Daisy marries him too early, she risks getting stuck in a domestic role before reaching the circles Mayday actually needs her to infiltrate. And Gilead has always weaponized domesticity. The moment women enter marriage, their world becomes smaller, expectations tighten, freedom shrinks, surveillance increases. Suddenly, life becomes about performance, obedience, and maintaining appearances. For someone secretly tied to resistance efforts, that's dangerous. Would Daisy still have opportunities to help Mayday? Probably. But will she have access to the highest level conversations? That becomes harder. And from a storytelling perspective, that matters too. Think about the way the Testaments builds tension. The story rarely pushes characters backward. Stakes escalate, risks deepen. If Daisy's journey is meant to become more dangerous, and everything suggests it is, then narratively her path should move closer to Gilead's center of power, not farther away. That's why I struggle to believe Garth is the endgame, not because the pairing is impossible, because it feels too small. And this is where things start getting uncomfortable, because if Daisy doesn't marry Garth, then we have to ask a much darker question. Who benefits most from Daisy? And suddenly, one name becomes impossible to ignore: Commander Judd. Now let's be clear, this possibility is terrifying because Commander Judd represents something far bigger than authority. He represents power at the highest level of Gilead: influence, image-making, political manipulation. He's exactly the kind of man Gilead uses to shape narratives. And if the Testament wants to make a statement about control, fear, and sacrifice, pairing Daisy with someone like Judd suddenly becomes very interesting. Think about what that marriage would symbolize. A respected Pearl girl becoming tied to a powerful commander would look perfect on the surface. Publicly, Gilead could present it as a shining example of loyalty and devotion. It reinforces the regime's values. It sends a message to everyone watching. But underneath, it becomes dangerous in ways a marriage to Garth never could. Because proximity changes everything. If Daisy somehow ended up near Commander Judd, she suddenly gains access to the rooms where decisions happen: elite gatherings, private discussions, political conversations hidden behind closed doors, information that Mayday could desperately need. And honestly, from a narrative perspective, this creates infinitely more tension. Imagine Daisy trying to survive inside that environment, while secretly carrying another agenda. Every conversation becomes dangerous. Every mistake carries consequences. Every moment feels like exposure is one step away. That is compelling television, far more compelling than a relatively quiet domestic arrangement with someone still working his way up. But there's another reason this theory feels frighteningly possible. The Testament has never shied away from making its characters suffer for the greater mission. That's important, because fans sometimes assume resistance automatically means empowerment. But in this world, resistance usually costs something painful. Sacrifice is part of survival. Characters are constantly forced into impossible choices, where every outcome hurts. So if Daisy were pushed towards someone like Commander Judd, the real tragedy wouldn't just be the marriage itself, it would be what she loses in the process. Her freedom, her identity, her emotional safety. Being close to power inside Gilead means living beside cruelty, manipulation, and surveillance every single day. Daisy wouldn't just be infiltrating the system, she would be trapped inside its most dangerous layer. And honestly, that feels exactly like the kind of cruel storytelling this universe thrives on. Still, we shouldn't ignore another possibility. What if all of us are focusing too much on marriage? Seriously, what if Becka disappearing isn't automatically setting up a replacement bride storyline at all? This is where fans need to be careful not to assume Gilead operates like a neat equation. Becka gone does not necessarily mean new bride enters. It could, but the Testament loves misdirection. Sometimes the obvious consequence exists purely to distract viewers from the real story developing underneath. What if Garth's disrupted future isn't actually about Daisy at all? What if it's about Garth? Because losing Becka could reshape him completely. People underestimate how much disappointment changes characters inside oppressive systems. Someone who feels abandoned, betrayed, or destabilized can become more loyal to power or begin quietly questioning it. And honestly, Garth feels like someone standing at a crossroads. Maybe losing Becka hardens him. Maybe he doubles down on loyalty to Gilead to prove himself worthy. But maybe, just maybe, it cracks something open. Because once someone realizes Gilead can take away their future without warning, blind obedience becomes harder. That possibility matters, and it would actually make Garth more interesting than simply becoming Daisy's husband. Meanwhile, there's technically another option still floating around in the background: Commander Maddox. Yes, he remains unmatched. But if we're being brutally honest, this feels narratively weak. Since Maddox is tied to the colonies, a marriage there doesn't really expand Daisy's influence or create stronger stakes for Mayday's mission. Unless the writers are planning some shocking twist connected to the colonies, this route feels disconnected from the main conflict. Could it happen? Sure. But would it be the strongest storytelling choice? Probably not. And that's really what this entire conversation comes down to: storytelling logic. Because when you analyze the Testaments, the best predictions usually come from asking one question: what creates the most tension? Not what feels safest, not what feels most comfortable. tension. A Daisy and Garth pairing feels stable. A Daisy and Judd possibility feels terrifying. And terrifying usually wins in shows like this. Still, there's one thing we absolutely shouldn't ignore. The writers know audiences are speculating, which means there's always a possibility that the show deliberately builds us toward one expectation only to flip the board. And honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if that happens here. Because Becka disappearing already shattered what looked predictable. The obvious future is gone. Now everything feels unstable. That uncertainty is exactly where the Testaments becomes dangerous. Right now, Daisy sits in an incredibly vulnerable position. If Gilead sees value in her, she could be strategically placed. If Mayday sees opportunity, her mission could deepen. And if power-hungry commanders start viewing her as useful, things could become terrifyingly quickly. Which is why I still think Garth feels more like the distraction than the destination. He makes sense logically, but he doesn't create enough danger. And danger is the language this show speaks fluently. At the end of the day, Becka disappearing didn't just destroy one wedding, it completely reshuffled the board. Garth's future suddenly looks uncertain. Daisy's path feels more dangerous than ever, and the possibility of forced political marriages now hangs over everything. Could Daisy marry Garth? Absolutely. But if the Testaments is playing the long game, and history says it usually is, then I think there's a bigger storm coming. Because the scariest possibility isn't Daisy ending up with someone safe. It's Daisy ending up exactly where Mayday needs her to be, at a cost so devastating she may barely recognize herself by the end. And if that's where the story is heading, then Becka disappearing may not have been the twist. It may have only been the first domino.